Okay, I'm going to just jump in just really quickly because James talked about the competency beyond the BCLAD, and I think we're looking at the students and we're talking about the students, but we also need to talk about the proficiency level of teachers. When teachers don't have the skills to reframe or redo, one of the principals I worked with, she wanted to put an native English teacher who knew Spanish, but the Spanish was not at a high level. And she says, well, I'll just put her in the kindergarten level because, there's not. I said, no, that's where you need, you're building the foundation. So, we need to also look, Magali at the center put together, we worked with the University of, in Mexico to put together a program so that teachers begin to build their own skills in Spanish. So it's not just giving the language opportunities to students, it's also having teachers. I was a bilingual teacher. We didn't give very many classes in Spanish. And so if we need science and math and all the other terminology that we need to teach those classes, then we need to build the skills also. So it's a very important point. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's back to one of my favorite subjects. I really sincerely believe that part of our job is to get our students to some kind of an intermediate level so that they're able to go much beyond the classroom. Absolutely giving time to read quality literature, good interaction. But once the students can go beyond the classroom, they see that it's not only to talk to my teacher and to my grandparents, it's to talk to students in Puerto Rico, it's to talk to students in Argentina, to do some kind of an investigation. Sometimes there are common things that they overlook until they have to report and talk about their own reality and compare with someone else. Then there's the motivation, because they're also getting exposed to children that are their age, that are native speakers in a different context, and now they're having to explain and articulate. And so they're going to be more motivated to perfect their language, and then as they are able to engage, then it's a spiral that will continue.
Yes.
Which reminded me, I had a question for you, Carla, and maybe you could address it now. I also had a question for Elvira.
Yes.
And maybe I'll just throw that one out, but then I want this one, because it just was what you were talking about. The question for you is, you mentioned the meta-linguistic awareness. We all know that kids vary, that learners vary. Some are more likely to become aware than others. So my question to you is, because you threw it out there, it sounded great, but I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, but isn't it differential? Some kids are going to be better at meta-linguistics than others. So some kids can add that third, fourth, fifth. In Minnesota, we're seeing kids who come at the university level, they're already onto their fifth language. They've done Spanish, Portuguese, French. They're into Chinese and Japanese. And maybe they're adding Somali. I don't know. It's amazing, the number of, but I'd say those are the more meta-linguistically aware. But back to the thing you just raised, Carla. We were talking about pragmatics, but they're pragmatics. In Japanese, it's probably more a monocultural thing, all the way from Hokkaido all the way down to Hiroshima, and then further south, maybe the pragmatics are shared, a lot of it is. But we know the pragmatics, the way it's showing up linguistically, and people like Plasencia and Marquez Ryder and others have published books on the pragmatics of different Spanishes. We're finding our kids trip over it all the time when they go in Spanish immersion. They go to Madrid. They've learned, because their teacher was from Uruguay or Ecuador, they're learning to use the conditional. Podría usted entregarme un vaso de agua? And they get to Spain and they use the podría, and their host parent laughs in their face. And why aren't you just saying vaso de agua? What's all this formality about? So that there are differences in Spanishes. How do you handle that in a Spanish-speaking environment? I know I attended one class. The woman was a Peruvian teacher in an immersion program in the Twin Cities. Is she somehow having to be a representative for all Spanishes, or is she just teaching the kids a Peruvian Spanish?
Well, I think it just gets back to, again, once you are able to begin to communicate, it's to provide a wide variety of abilities and context for communication. In the Portuguese program, there were Brazilians, there were continental Portuguese speakers, and from the Azores. So we had 3 different types of Portuguese right there. So fortunately, at least the students had an exposure, a wider exposure. Of course, course, the students at the lower levels are they're going to try to mimic their teacher, but they're also going to want to speak with their peers. If they have those kinds of structured types of interactions, they're going to be motivated. So I think we don't have to think so narrowly by looking at different kinds of literature. Children will be exposed to different contexts if we orchestrate those contexts for them.
And I think part of that is the interrelatedness of the pragmatics and then the opportunity to think about one's own knowledge of linguistics and languages and one's coming together with one's ability, because some of us have more ability, if you will, to have that kind of language ear, but to be able to introduce that the same way we would introduce the opportunity for students to be aware of their learning, their strengths in learning, is the opportunity for them to be very aware from the beginning of their strengths in being able to traverse between the languages and to highlight that. So something as simple as being aware of cognates and what that means and next steps that we take as learners to be able to compensate for or add to our abilities in language learning.
One tiny question, because we only have 1 minute left.
Can I say something really quickly about that? I'll be very fast. I'll speak in English, but like a Cuban. The one thing I did want to say is the explicit, and Carla alluded to this, that through the literature, a lot of times you can expose them to these different kinds of wordings and different kinds of expressions that are used throughout different countries. But it's really being explicit, like closed passages, where you see if the students have some tactical awareness of what word they would use there, and then using that as an opportunity to really talk about the different kinds of vocabulary that exists. For example, we talk about the context of, you know, if you go to Mexico and you say, "Puedo traer un vaso de agua?" and the waiter says, "Sí, ahorita." You know, Cuba will be like, "¿Qué te pasa?" You know, it's like, because it means something different. But it's making kids aware of those, how even within countries, just like you're saying, there's different words that are used in different ways that are expressed, but it has to be explicit. I think it has to be something that's explicitly taught to our students.
Okay, your last.
Which kind of, in a way, maybe answers my question.
Okay.
Because I want to direct it at James as a Cuban. And I'll tell you this, because I have taught with the esteemed Senora Mejia for many years. And I find that students that have her for 3rd grade and me for 4th grade, well, they're kind of like messed up for life. Because as a Cuban, we speak differently, and you recognize that in your response right now. And I want to ask you, when you are doing this, how do you avoid staying, because it's very difficult to detach yourself from the language that you learn first. So how do you accomplish that?
It's really, for me, it's the mentality of which mode am I in. If I'm in a teacher mode where I'm actually in instruction, I've learned to, you know, even though tengo hambre, no me trago la S, to make sure I'm not saying, you know, callado, that I'm actually pronouncing the words. I have to be very aware of that. The one thing I do not do is slow down my Spanish. I know when 6th graders first come in, they're like, whoa, because I speak very quickly. But it's really, I think it's part of our immersion programs is that we also have to develop the ear for language, because the same thing, if you slow down your Spanish to where you are speaking as if it's a foreign language, suddenly the last student's immersed in a language, they go to Spain or Mexico or anywhere else, where they're speaking at a normal rate, all of a sudden they're going to have a shock because they have not developed the ear for it. So while I do make sure that I try to remove my accent as much, again, in a formal situation. If it's informal, I'm talking to my students, the Cuban comes out. But the rate, I do stay pretty close to the rate because I'm trying to develop the ear. So it's really being aware of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Fortunately, I depend on my adjuncts who come from other countries. That seems to be, and having been out of immersion for 6 years and coming back again this year, I find, oh no, I have to hide my inner Cuban. Not necessarily slow it down, but great.
And you know, and it really makes the kids aware that there are different dialects.
Like I said, if they've had us one after the other.
But no, they're not messed up for life, because as James was saying, in my classroom, I speak a completely different Spanish.
Yes, we have to go.
than I do with my family. So
You can
you're
catch them in the, or at the reception. These great dialogues could take place. Thank